So, Professor Richard Wolff with us in this second hour Thursday. He is the Economist, co-founder of Democracy at Work, author most recently of Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. His website's democracyatwork.info and rdwolff with two Fs.com. You can tweet him at Prof Wolff, PROFWOLFF, or at democracy at WRK. Professor Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Tom. I'm really glad to be with you again.
I'm very glad to have you again. I would like to present for your consideration two contrasting stories that were published today. One, the analysis of this was provided by AmericansForTaxFairness.org. It links off a story that I believe was in the Financial Times this morning. A new analysis shows that, quote, Charles Koch and David Koch and/or Koch Industries could save between $1 and $1.4 billion every year from the Trump tax law, and the Koch group spent over $20 million promoting the tax bill that ultimately became law, according to a fact sheet they provided to the Wall Street Journal. So on the one hand, they invest $20 million in our political process. They make $1 billion a year forever. On the other hand, we have this article by Angus Deaton in the New York Times today. The headline, "The U.S. can no longer hide from its deep poverty problem." And they point out that the poorest people in the world are those who live on $1.90 or less a day. And they say there's 3.2 million such people in the United States. And if you adjust it for, the equivalent of inflation, I guess you'd call it, it's really 5.3 million Americans are living in the kind of poverty that we usually associate with places like Bangladesh. What's your take on these two contrasting stories? What does this mean? How did we get here? How do we get out of this?
Well, it's becoming commonplace, and so I guess I'm a little cynical almost about this. This contrast between the needs of this economy and how it is in fact working. It's a wonderful investment for the Koch brothers to spend, as you put it, $20 million on a political process that saves them $1.5 billion each year. That's a rate of return that far exceeds anything else they could have done with the $20 million, to say the least. Let me put it in another way. Back in 2014, a famous French economist named Thomas Piketty wrote a book that lots of folks, including you and I, commented on publicly. It showed that capitalism as a system is continuously producing ever worse inequality, and that it will eventually blow up and threaten the system. And that he concluded his book by saying, that one of the ways to try to stop this is to put a higher tax on the wealthy. Well, at the end of 2017, last year, the United States did exactly the opposite. It reduced the taxes on corporations. It reduced the taxes on the wealthy more than it reduced taxes on anybody else. In other words, not only do we have, as Angus Deaton points out, extraordinary poverty in this country, but we are making it worse. And that's because we have a political system in which the rich have figured out that sooner or later they're going to be in trouble, and they want it to be later. So they bought the political process. So not only does it not offset the inequality, it abets it. It makes it worse. And all I can say as an observer with my fellow economists looking at this is, God help the United States as it plunges headlong into a level of inequality that has political and social implications that really ought to make you shake in your boots.
For example, what are the implications that you're suggesting?
Well, I don't think it's sustainable. The United States prided itself for most of the 20th century by saying that we had a capitalism that created a large middle class, that created a high standard of living, that created a situation where everybody had an equal chance. All of that is disappearing. And even though there are a lot of people who deny it and who try to postpone facing up to it, the reality hammers itself home to everybody in this country sooner or later. And when the excuses give out and when the denial is no longer sustainable, Americans are going to confront that they're in a situation in which there is no middle class anymore, and if you're not in the top 5% of the population, your economic future, and even more that of your children, is heading down into the way we used to see other parts of the world we called poor. And I think that's going to produce political extremes of the left and right. You can be sure we already see the right-wing version of it, and at least incipiently a little bit of the other side. But you're going to see more and more anger and bitterness, and you're going to see irresponsible demagogues trying to take advantage of it. We're heading for very, very hard times that we didn't need to have had we had a little less of a determination of those at the top to simply keep riding this inequality horse into a disaster. That's what I think is coming.
Yeah. On an unrelated, somewhat unrelated issue, I'm curious your thoughts on the new Fed chair who was just, I believe he was just, what's the word, ratified by the Senate or whatever, installed.
Right. Well, I'm afraid it's the same thing. It's same old, same old. You know, you weren't going to get out of Janet Yellen, who went to the Yale Graduate School of Economics with me, who I've known on and off, all my life. You weren't going to get much change from her. You certainly weren't going to get it from Ben Bernanke before her, and you're not going to get it from. These are people who are committed to pretending that nothing is all that wrong. Everything is rolling along really pretty well. I mean, they see the same stories you and I do, whether it be the Koch brothers or Angus Deaton's work today, or the Oxfam report of this last few days that documents in even greater detail the inequality that is mushrooming around the world. But they choose to imagine that it's all okay, that the mass of the American people will simply accept that the middle-class dreams they had, the so-called American dream, is forever moving further and further away, and that they will just hunker down into their insecure job and live at a standard of living they never thought they would bequeath to their kids. I don't think they will, and I think we're going to see all the signs, as if Trump weren't already one himself, all the signs of a system that isn't working, that is generating the political leaders and the upheaval that we kind of see mushrooming around us.
In our last minute here, in the 50s and 60s, more than half of Congress were veterans. Now there's very few veterans in Congress. So there was a kind of a different view of veterans back then. Similarly, in the 50s and 60s, most members of the House of Representatives were not wealthy. Most politicians were not wealthy, and the Senate was always the millionaires club, but just kind of modest millionaires. That has changed. To what extent do you think that, for example, Janet Yellen and all her friends on the Fed, these are people who never were part of the middle class. They were always part of the top 1% or the top 5%. Is it possible that they just don't see the problems?
Well, I mean, it's not only possible, it's clear. I circulate among those people because I went to the same elite schools, and I can assure you that when we meet together, I am constantly amazed at the ability of people who go to nice restaurants and live in lovely parts of town and have good vacations to simply not want to see, I suppose it's partly human, that they are in a shrinking minority and that it is becoming beleaguered around them. They see some of the symptoms, but yes, they do live in another world, and they don't want to be confronted with how that world is changing, and that situation historically always ends badly.
Yeah, and let's hope that when it ends badly here, that it ends badly in a way that at least leaves this country intact, and that we can produce something good out of it. I know you've done a lot of brilliant work on how to make lemonade out of these lemons, and I encourage people to check out your writing and your website, democracyatwork.info, rdwolff.com. Professor Wolff, thank you.